Hey guys, Jester here. Today I'm going to be going over the first and second edition Player's Handbooks and Dungeon Master's Guides. As I said on my last video, the difference between these two copies of the Player's Handbook and these two copies of the Dungeon Master Guide, the only difference is the covers. Inside the Player's Handbook is exactly the same, and the inside of the Dungeon Master's Guide is exactly the same. Now, also in my last video, I said that this was my favorite cover of all of the books, which it is. So I'll be using this one as opposed to this one in today's discussion. Great artwork on this, love it, but I like this one above all. Between these two, this cover, meh, don't really care for it that much, so we'll be putting him aside. Now, like I said, the only difference between the two is the covers. So much so that, okay, here's the cover to this one. Remember, same book. On the bottom of the page here, it says, cover. The book cover painting shows an encounter between three adventurers and an Ifrit on the elemental plane of fire. The fabled city of brass can be seen floating over a flame-swept sea of oil. Come on, guys. That's this book cover, not this book cover. At least if you're going to change the cover, change the description. But anyway. So, in order to talk about first edition books, I'm actually going to start with the second edition books. Okay? Oh, I will say this first. This came out in '78. This came out in '79. Both of these came out in '89. The Player's Handbook came out first in January, and DMG came out in February. I've had these books ever since they came out, pretty much. So, as you can see, the cover is completely gone. It's quite worn and destroyed. The spine's gone on this one. Pages started falling out in this, so I actually just went ahead and ripped out some of the pages that I needed for my homemade Dungeon Master screen that I put on a cereal box that I cut open and pulled out. It's actually behind me right here. But anyway, the reason I wanted to start with these is the forewords. It's not the only reason, but that's where we'll start at. The forewords were made by David Zeb Cook. And don't think I'm actually going to read the one from the Player's Handbook, but it's the one from the Dungeon Master's Guide that pretty much says everything about the game. Just kind of sums it up really nicely. And it kind of touches on some of the points that's been hot topics of late that people just don't understand. So hopefully after reading this there'll be a more understanding of everything. But anyway, here we go. A foreword is normally the place where the author of a book expresses thanks and gratitude. I'm not going to do that here. It's not that everyone involved doesn't deserve congratulations and praise. It's just that I already said all those things in the foreword to the AD&D second edition Player's Handbook. Everything I said there is true for this book too. On to other things. Let's assume that since you're reading this, you are or plan to be a Dungeon Master. By now you should be familiar with the rules in the Player's Handbook. You've probably already noticed things you like or things you would have done differently. If you have, congratulations. You've got the spirit every Dungeon Master needs. Curiosity and the desire to make changes, to do things differently because your idea is better than the other guy's. These are the most important things a Dungeon Master needs. As you go through this rulebook, I encourage you to continue to make these choices. Choice is what the second edition is all about. We've tried to offer you what we think are the best choices for your AD&D campaign, but each of us has different likes and dislikes. The game that I enjoy may be quite different from your own campaign, but it is not for me to say what is right or wrong for your game. True, I and everyone working on the second edition have had to make fundamental decisions, but we've tried to avoid being dogmatic and inflexible. The AD&D game is yours, it's mine, it's every player's game. So, is there an official AD&D game? Yes, but only when there needs to be. Although I don't have a crystal ball, it's likely that tournaments and other official events will use all of the core rules in these books. Optional rules may or may not be used, but it's fair to say that all players need to know about them even if they don't have them memorized. The Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide give you what you're expected to know, but that doesn't mean the game begins and ends there. Your game will go in directions not yet explored, and your players will try things others think strange. Sometimes these strange things will work, but sometimes they won't. Just accept this, be ready for it, and enjoy it. Take the time to have fun with the AD&D rules. Add, create, expand, and extrapolate. Don't just let the game sit there, and don't become a rules lawyer worrying about each piddly little detail. If you can't figure out the answer, make it up. And whatever you do, don't fall into the trap of believing these rules are complete. They are not. You cannot sit back and let the rule book do everything for you. Take the time and effort to become not just a good DM, but a brilliant one. At conventions, in letters, and over the phone, I'm often asked for the instant answer to a fine point of the game rules. More often than not, I come back with a question. What do you feel is right? And the people asking the questions discover that not only can they create an answer, but their answer is as good as anyone else's. The rules are only guidelines. At the beginning of the first Dungeon Master's Guide, Gary Gygax stressed that each of us, working from a common base, would make the AD&D game grow in a variety of different directions. That is more true today than ever. Don't be afraid of experimentation, but do be careful. As a Dungeon Master, you have great power, and with great power comes great responsibility. Use it wisely. I'm not going to say anything about that. I'm just going to let it sit there and resonate. The other thing I'm going to mention about in the credits here, this has also been a hot topic as far as inclusiveness is concerned. Just on the supposed lack of females. Hundreds of players assisted us in playtesting the second edition. Their efforts were invaluable in improving the manuscript. The list that follows is not complete, but we would like to thank, and it goes on to list a crap load of playtesters. There were probably about 30 to 40% of the names listed here were women. What it appeared is though that the majority of those were actually wives of corresponding husbands that were also playtesters. But nevertheless, the whatever is out there that the game was designed to be bigotry against women or whatever, that's hogwash. But this is just a little bit of proof right here. But anyway, that's all I'll say about that. Alright, so when Dungeons and Dragons first came out, you had the basic set, and like I said before, in the basic rule book, it was basically the Player's Handbook, the DMG, and the Monster Manual all rolled into one. So all any player needed was that one rule book, and whether they be a player or dungeon master, and they could do everything that they wanted to do. They'd know everything they wanted to know. Now I'm only speculating here. I don't know. When this set came out, first edition, the Player's Handbook only had just basically basic information for what the players needed to roll up their character and understand their character. In other words, there was nowhere. Okay, so like in second edition here, you've got a whole bunch of information at the player's fingertips, including what they need to hit, like combat tables, attack matrices, that sort of thing. Um, but they changed it in second edition from here, and I'll go over that in a minute. But basically, bottom line is, players didn't have anything in the player's handbook that they really didn't need to know. Dungeon Master's Guide had everything else. So it basically put all of the work on the DM, not that that's a bad thing, but the Dungeon Master had all the information. So basically, when you went into combat and you came upon a monster or whatever, Dungeon Master's got the combat table, so he's the only one, unless players own this book and have read it, that knows what they need to hit for an armor class and yada yada yada. And so, it in my opinion, it allowed the player to role play more and not worry about what they needed to do this, what they needed to do that, because the saving throw tables and everything was in here. There was none of that information in here. All you had in here was how to roll up your, like I said, how to roll up your character, what it meant to be a human or a dwarf or an elf, whatever. Did have some information about psionics. Of course, it had your spell listings and descriptions and stuff, so forth and so on. But it was basically just an information thing. All of the mechanics involved was in this. That changed when second edition came around. Second edition, one of the big things was THAC0, which is to hit armor class 0. Now, some people will argue that THAC0 didn't exist in first edition. I would actually argue against that and say that it did, it just wasn't called THAC0. When you look at the Dungeon Master's Guide here, you had in the Dungeon Master's Guide combat tables, and it basically just, let's see if I can find it here real quick. Alright, where'd you go? Sorry, didn't have this ready to go. Anyway, you had combat tables that, here we go, attack matrices and combat tables for every specific character. So if you played a cleric or a druid, here's the combat tables that you would use that goes by armor class and your level. So it was a cross-reference between armor class and level. Okay, same thing for fighters and monks and magic users, what have you. That in effect was THAC0. It just didn't break it down the way they did in second edition. Again, those combat tables that was in here, not available in the player's handbook. Players didn't have to worry about that stuff. It's like, what do I need to hit, and what do I need for saving throw? It gave the dungeon master an opportunity in that sense to fudge, if you want to call it that, the rolls, either in favor of or against the player based on the story that the dungeon master wanted to portray. It gave him more freedom to let the flow of the game determine the outcome, as opposed to, like in the forward that I read, the rules lawyers wanting to argue, well, that's not what I needed to hit. How come I didn't hit, or something of that effect? You know what I'm saying? Basically, the more information the players have, sometimes can be a bad thing. In second edition, they changed it and they added all that information in the player's handbook. So now the players know what they need to save against this, that, and the other. They know what they need to hit when it comes to a certain armor class, and so forth and so on. So that took that element out of the game. unless the dungeon master in his own home campaign deemed it doesn't matter what the rule book says, because again, rules are the guidelines, not necessarily the rules. It's set in stone. So, so basically, that's really the only difference in second edition and first edition, was just that second edition streamlined it a little bit more in favor of the players, giving them more information, which in my opinion they really didn't need to know. But I will say though, if you've played second edition, which I pretty much play second edition, but and that's another conundrum. It's like you say you play second edition, but if second edition's the only thing you've played, you're still playing basic and first edition. There's basic, first edition, second edition. It's all the same game. Some people argue that there's 3 separate games. They're not. They are the same game. They're just it's the way I like to describe it. It's like the card games. You have Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic the Gathering. Pokemon is your most basic card game. It's meant for small kids. And please don't twist what I'm saying and saying that the basic edition is for children, not adults. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to put it in perspective. Pokemon is for small kids. Yu-Gi-Oh is for a little bit older kids, and Magic the Gathering is for adults. Basically, you're being trained at an early age with Pokemon how to play Magic the Gathering, and in that same sense, basic Dungeons and Dragons is your, what it says, basic level of gameplay. First edition is the next step up, and in second edition is the next step up. But not even so much as that. It's just more of, first edition was pretty much the actual next step up, and second edition was just a little tweaking of first edition. But again, like I said, in reality, all 3 are the same game. Once you get into third edition and beyond that, it's a completely different game. I mean, it's almost unrecognizable from Dungeons and Dragons, from the original Dungeons and Dragons. It in my opinion, shouldn't even be called Dungeons and Dragons, because it's not the same game. But there'll be plenty of people that argue against that too, so, but anyway, whether you play second edition, third edition, beyond, whatever you play, this right here is, in my opinion, a must-have. The first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. There is so much information, crazy information, in this book. I mean, you can read it and read it and read it, and every time you read it, you find something different. It's like, wow, I didn't know that was in there. There are things, I mean, it's an incredibly detailed book on just crazy. It's got diseases, all the different types of diseases that you can catch, all the different types of mental illnesses that you can be afflicted upon you. Under the NPCs, it breaks down the varying levels of basically a harlot. It goes into from the one extreme to the upper extreme. I mean, it's just a wealth of information in here. It's just mind-boggling of what you can find in this book that is in no other book designed by Dungeons and Dragons, Wizards of the Coast, TSR, whatever you want to call them. It's crazy. So yeah, the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, a must have. Oh, do not want to drop that. Anyway, so that about all I got. I mean, if you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, there's not really a whole lot more to say. If you haven't played Dungeons and Dragons, then why not? You know, I mean, it's out there. I would suggest if you've never played and you want to start playing, pick up copies of these, or even these. You can find them on eBay. Don't pay the ridiculous prices that some people are wanting. Just for instance, I just recently purchased new copies of these two books. The one I got of this one hasn't quite arrived yet. It should be here in a few days, but purchased it for $30. This one, I actually got a new copy of. When I say new, it's all of these are out of print, so there is no new copies. But the copy I got was, I mean, it looked almost new. There was a couple little dings, you know, in it, whatever, but it's a very good copy, and no writings, highlightings, or anything inside. And also got the first monstrous compendium, which was a 3-ring binder type of monster manual thing that they put out. It wasn't in its original binder, but the seller provided a 3-ring binder to hold it all in. Got both the DMG and that monstrous compendium with the generic 3-ring binder for $18.50. So you can find great deals out there. You don't have to spend $50 on a new 5e Dungeon Master's Guide and then another $50 on a new 5e Player's Handbook. You can find all of the old school stuff for very reasonable prices if you just have some patience and take the time to wait and, you know, bid and argue, not necessarily argue, but barter, haggle, that's the best word, haggle. You can find great deals. And this is, original Dungeons & Dragons is the best edition out there, bar none, because that's the real Dungeons & Dragons. So, that's all I got today, guys. And as always, see you soon.